Hello everyone, this is Major Green, also known as Nitpicking Nerd, and this is a review of episode 9 of Star Trek Discovery, and it's the mid-season final, so it's kind of a cliffhanger episode, so I kind of predicted it will be a better episode than usual, and it was indeed a very good episode. I did enjoy it. I think it's the first time I really enjoyed an episode of the show. Of course, it still has a lot of problems, and I'm going to analyze all of them. So, the first problem, they didn't actually do anything at all with the Pavo planet from the previous episode. Nothing at all except a brief mention in the beginning. So, all that setup was basically for nothing. And they didn't even use any of those planets' crystals to find a solution to the Klingon cloaking device. They found some other way to do that. So, what was even the point of the whole previous episode? It led to nothing. And as for the Klingon cloaking devices, I made a whole video about that, trying to justify it because it's a very big contradiction with the original series, in which both Kirk and Spock were very surprised to see cloaking devices, as if they never heard about them before. And Spock even said it was only theoretically possible to bend light to be invisible, and so obviously they never encountered that before. And I tried to justify it by saying that maybe the Klingons are using a totally different kind of cloaking, and I listed a whole bunch of examples from all the Star Trek shows about different kinds of cloaks, and I said maybe Spock was specifically talking about the bending of light. So I said in the end of that video that what they should do is simply not mention the bending of light, and then it wouldn't be a direct contradiction with Spock's statement. And yet they did exactly the one thing I said they shouldn't do. They directly stated that the cloak works by bending the light around it. So they did exactly the one thing I said they shouldn't do. And also the new cloak doesn't even look like it's bending light. Unlike the old special effect of the cloaking that always created those ripples around the ship, indicating that the light itself is bending, yet the new special effect of the Klingons, it looked more like a hologram screen going up, so even visually it doesn't really fit. So there's really no way out of this mess now except setting this whole show in a different universe, which might still happen. I'll discuss that later. And if they do that, then that can explain away all the contradictions with other shows. And there's a whole bunch of them. Even the Vulcan Admiral that we keep seeing is kind of a contradiction, because wasn't Spock supposed to be the first Vulcan in Starfleet? And we have a whole bunch of other small inconsistencies. Many of them can be easily explained away, so that's why I didn't even want to mention them. But since we have so many of such inconsistencies, overall it's really hard to swallow it being a prequel to the original series. It doesn't really make sense anymore. And one more example is the side-to-side transporting inside the starship, which they only did once in the original series, and Kirk asked, is that possible? So it's as if he never even heard about this option before, and Spock said that it was very dangerous to do that inside the ship, and yet here in Discovery we see people transporting inside the ship all the time with no problems. And you know, even by the time of TNG, they were still not doing that except in emergencies. They never used that casually. They always went over to the transport room to beam down to a planet. They never did that from the bridge except in rare occasions. So presumably it was still a little bit dangerous even at the time of TNG, which is a century after this show. And yet here in this show they do it casually all the time as if it's nothing. So even though it doesn't directly contradict it, because it was possible in the original series, they did do that in that one episode, but it's still kind of fishy because it's not in the spirit of the old show, in which they said it's so dangerous to do that, and yet here they do it without any mention of the danger. And so I do view it as a little bit of a contradiction. And the same with the holodecks we saw, which seemed a little bit too advanced for this time period, and the replicators that are not supposed to exist yet. Remember in Star Trek 6 we actually saw a kitchen on the ship. We actually saw that they have to cook food, and that was decades later. So how can they have replicators on this show when they didn't have them in the original? They only had the food slots, which were more of a food dispenser and not really a replicator. They couldn't really create anything they wanted. Otherwise, why would they need the kitchen on the ship that we saw in Star Trek 6? So because there are so many such inconsistencies, I think it's better off to just say that this whole show is set in a different universe, and I'll discuss that later as well. So anyway, back to the plot of this episode. So this Vulcan Admiral seems kind of emotional for a Vulcan, I think. Maybe he's not fully Vulcan as well, we don't know. And he orders the Discoverer to fall back, but of course Captain Lorca, as always, doesn't listen to anyone. And I do like Captain Lorca. I think he's my favorite character on the show. So basically Captain Lorca only pretends to obey his orders and then secretly plans to do something else. And the crew of the Discovery figure out a way to overcome the Klingon cloaking device, but to do that they have to beam aboard the Klingon ship and set up special sensors on the ship, which will allow them to see the frequency of the Klingon cloaking device, and that would allow them to see the ship. And now the problem with that is that it was so easy to beam aboard the Klingon ship, then why not just beam up a whole battalion? Why only 2 people? But you know, this is something that was always done on Star Trek in many of the movies, many of the episodes, and usually they had some excuse for it, and they say something like the transporter only has enough power left only to beam up 1 person and stuff like that. So usually they had some kind of technobabble excuse for it. Here they don't really give us an excuse, but I guess we can make something up ourselves. So I say maybe the Klingon sensors would have detected them if they sent over more than 2 people. So that's the bare minimum they could send without being detected. And very conveniently they stumble across the Admiral and L'Rell. And when Ash sees L'Rell, he has some flashbacks that look like torture, but also might be him remembering the procedure that turned him into a human. And I think this episode pretty much almost confirms that he is indeed Vok, especially in the end. But at this point in the episode I wasn't yet sure, because it seems like he doesn't really remember being a Klingon, that he really thinks he was a prisoner, he really thinks he was just being tortured. And also in all the previous episodes he seems to act completely human. There was never any indication that he has any trouble fitting in with humans. And so the question was, how come he knows how to act like humans so much? And the answer is that he has the memories of an actual human. And so maybe Ash Tyler was an actual human being who got captured by the Klingons, and then Vok was given his appearance and his memories and forgot his identity as Vok. So he basically became a sleeper agent that doesn't even know that he's a spy, and only later presumably he will be activated with his real memories. So meanwhile the Discovery is jumping all around the Klingon ship because they have to gather all the sensor information to figure out how the clock works. And that did look cool. I have to admit the special effect in this episode, I did kind of like it. I also liked Michael confronting the head Klingon. That was kind of cool. Also we finally get to see the Klingons fighting, because almost in this entire show we only see them talking all the time. We never actually saw the Klingons fighting except that one scene, also with Michael, but we never saw them fighting each other. They were always just standing around talking. And that was really annoying, because the Klingons are supposed to be challenging each other and fighting each other. That's how it was in all the other shows. That's why that was so fun. And yet here they were just standing around talking, trying to look cool. It was like seeing Jedi without a lightsaber. So something was terribly wrong with these Klingons, and they were boring as hell. So finally we have some action with the Klingons. And before the fight we see Michael using a universal translator to understand the Klingons, and then we start hearing them in English as well. And that's something that should have been done from the second episode. And then we wouldn't have had to read all those subtitles and listen to them barely able to speak. It would have been so much more fun to just hear them in English, maybe with some Klingon words in between. That would have been so much better. So anyway, here Michael is using a universal translator and we start hearing them in English, and then she brags about the universal translator. And this is once again kind of an inconsistency, because in the show Enterprise, which was a century earlier, we already saw humans and Klingons talking using a translator. And we heard the Klingons in English, so why are the Klingons surprised by a translator? It doesn't make sense. So it seems like yet another continuity problem. Now I guess it's possible the Klingons never bothered developing their own universal translator, and so they just expect everyone else to talk in their language to interact with them. And in a way it does fit the original series, because there were some episodes in which a Klingon said that half the quadrant is learning to speak Klingonese. And so that did seem to indicate that they are not using a translator. And even in TNG, when Riker was on a Klingon ship, the captain of that ship told everyone to speak in their language. So that indicated that they were not talking through a universal translator, but instead the Klingons were actually talking in English for Riker. And so whenever they wanted to say a word in their language, that's why everybody heard that. So maybe the Klingons have some sort of problem with a universal translator in principle, and that might explain some of the inconsistencies in all the other shows and movies, because a lot of times we saw Klingons talking in their language, and the human characters apparently also heard it in their language, so it wasn't translated. So maybe they have some kind of problem with the universal translator, maybe they demand people not to use them, and instead they talk in English when interacting with the Federation, and this way whenever they say something in Klingon, then everyone hears it in Klingon. So maybe it has something to do with their prideful culture, maybe they are so proud of their language that they are unwilling to have it translated by a computer, and instead they want everyone to learn to speak their language. And so Michael distracts the Klingons, and they totally forget all about the Discovery jumping all around them, and the fight scene was cool indeed. I did like the fight scene. Now L'Rell manages to escape with them by jumping on Ash when he's beaming out, and that reminded me of Star Trek 4, so we saw stuff like that happening before. So that was kind of neat, that was like an Easter egg. So after gathering all the data about the clocking device, they also destroy the Klingon ship and they kill Cole. So I guess that's the end of that whole story with the Klingons. And conveniently they get all the remaining Klingon characters we know on board the Discovery. And I loved how Lorca was dripping his eye drops in order to see the Klingon ship exploding. That was a very nice touch. So then Ash has a dream remembering sleeping with L'Rell, and that scene was kind of creepy, and it reminds me of a scene from the movie Rosemary's Baby, in which Rosemary was remembering having sex with the devil. This whole sequence looked really like that, so maybe they took a little bit of inspiration from that. And I guess this scene is the first ever sex scene we actually see in Star Trek, because we actually see the Klingon boobs and all of that stuff. So it's kind of breaking the tradition of Star Trek being a family show. And Ash then goes to visit L'Rell in the brig and asks her what she did with him, and she says, "Do not worry, I will never let them hurt you." So that pretty much confirms that he is indeed Vok, and she then says the word soon. So that seems to indicate that maybe his real memories and identity will start coming back soon, and then he will gradually become Vok again. I'm hoping that he will not revert completely to the Vok appearance. Maybe he'll be something in the middle, and that way he will look more like the old version of Klingons, the TNG Klingons. So I'm hoping he will be more like a hybrid Klingon, and maybe that whole thing will be used to explain all the Klingon inconsistencies. Maybe they can somehow use that to make all the Klingons look like that later, and this way solve that whole inconsistencies. So I guess we'll have to wait and see. Now that last spore drive, the special effect looked kind of different. It looked as if the ship was doubling, as if there are two Discovery ships, and it seems as if they arrived in a different universe. So this will probably be the mirror universe that we knew for a while now. We knew that there will be an episode set in the mirror universe, and some people theorize that the whole show is set in the mirror universe. That doesn't really make sense, because in the mirror universe there is no Federation, and they have no Prime Directive, and all the stuff we saw wouldn't exist in the mirror universe. So that's why I never bought the theory that the whole show is set in the mirror universe, even though that would have been a cool idea if they would actually do that from the beginning, but it doesn't seem likely. So instead I think they actually arrived in the mirror universe and will probably go back later. And maybe they won't go back. Maybe they will start jumping between universes. Maybe the whole show will become more like sliders. Maybe they'll be jumping into a new universe every time. And that would allow the show to have much more freedom. It would also explain away all the inconsistencies. They'll be able to do whatever they want. But I'm not sure I really like that idea as a whole, because that way they would never have any consequences to anything. So whatever they do in a different universe, it wouldn't really matter. So I'm not really sure that I like that idea. And also, what's even the point of having it as a prequel if it will be a completely separate offshoot series? So what was even the point of setting it as a prequel if they're not actually going to tie it to any backstory of anything? And so I'm not buying it. I think they will probably get back to their own universe later. But you know, they seem to kind of tie all the loose ends in this episode. So they killed off Cole, they destroyed that ship, they solved the Klingon cloaking devices, and they sent that information to the rest of Starfleet. So all of Starfleet knows it now, and they'll be able to win the war. So maybe they never come back. Maybe they will always be in a different universe, or jumping around between universes. And of course that can be used to explain all the inconsistencies. So I guess anything is possible, so we'll have to wait and see where they're going with it. I'm betting they will come back to their own universe eventually. And in the upcoming episode it will probably just be the mirror universe, the same one that we saw with the Empire instead of a Federation. So that might be a fun episode to see. And as for Stamets, I think what happened to him might be similar to what happened with Gary Mitchell in the original series. Also in the preview of the next episode we see that he seems to have superpowers. He seems to easily push that doctor away, so maybe he has ESP powers. So that might be a nice tie-in with Gary Mitchell from the original series, who also gained superpowers because the Enterprise was moving beyond the galaxy. So overall I really like this episode. I think this was the best episode yet. So let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you all next time.